and she knew in that moment that she couldn't keep it hidden any longer. She stood, clutching the letter and the memory card, and whispered into the wind, "I'll finish it, Keanu. I promise." Then she walked back toward her car, ready for what came next, the world premiere he had planned, and the truth she would finally share with everyone. But as she started the engine, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. The text read, "Don't release it. You don't know what you're risking?" Her heart froze. She stared at the screen, her pulse racing. Who could know about the video? And what did they mean by risking? Her headlights flickered as she looked into the rearview mirror. For the first time that night, she wasn't sure if she was alone. The light returns. The message on her phone glowed in the darkness. "Don't release it. You don't know what you're risking." Sandra sat frozen behind the wheel, rainwater dripping from her coat. Her pulse quickened. Outside, the street was empty, but the uneasy feeling that someone was watching her refused to fade. She looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness and fog. Still, her instincts whispered that this wasn't random. Someone didn't want Project Sunrise to see daylight. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You didn't fight all your life for kindness just for me to be afraid now," she whispered. The next morning, she went straight to Keanu's lawyer. His name was Robert Hayes, a quiet, composed man who had handled Keanu's private affairs for years. When Sandra told him about the message and the footage, his expression changed instantly. "You weren't supposed to know about that part," he said softly, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were old contracts, legal letters, and one particular document marked confidential. Sandra frowned. "What is this?" Robert hesitated. Keanu tried to release Project Sunrise years ago. He wanted it to be public, not owned by any studio. But the production company he'd signed with claimed rights over the footage. They said it didn't fit the brand, that it showed too much truth, too much pain. When he refused to let them alter it, they buried the project. "They buried it?" she repeated, disbelief thick in her voice. He nodded. He walked away from everything that year. "Bought back the material with his own money," he told me once. "If I can't tell the truth, it's not worth telling at all." Her eyes glistened. "And now someone's trying to stop it again." Robert looked uneasy. "The same company merged with a larger one 2 years ago. They're powerful. If you release the footage publicly, they might claim ownership or even sue to suppress it." Sandra sat back silent. The weight of it settled in. This was exactly what Keanu had fought, the system that profited from illusion and silenced what was real. After a long pause, she said quietly, "Then I'll finish it differently. I'll show it where no one can buy or bury it." Robert frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked out the window. "Live." That evening, Sandra called Mark, the archivist. Together, they set up a small projection space inside the same studio where Keanu had filmed his last messages, Soundstage 19. She didn't tell the press, only a few close friends, Keanu's family, and people who had worked with him through the years. But word spread, and by the time the night arrived, thousands were watching online. Drawn by the mysterious headline, "Sandra Bullock to reveal Keanu Reeves's final project." When she stepped onto the stage, the same wooden floor creaked under her feet. The smell of old paint and dust still lingered, but the lights above had been cleaned and restored. They shone softly now, like a sky full of patient stars. Sandra stood before the camera, holding Keanu's letter in her hands. The crowd fell silent. "He never wanted fame," she began. "He wanted truth. And truth, no matter how fragile, deserves light." She took a deep breath. "The project you're about to see isn't a movie. It's a collection of moments, real ones. The ones he thought mattered more than all the rest. It's about loss, love, kindness, and the quiet courage to keep believing when life feels impossible." Her voice trembled. "He called it Project Sunrise." She stepped back. The screen flickered to life. The footage began. Clips of strangers telling their stories, children laughing, people crying, lives intersecting in small acts of grace. Then came Keanu, walking through crowded streets, sitting beside a homeless man, talking softly to a nurse, fixing a broken bike for a boy in the rain. His voice played over it all. "The light we carry isn't meant to be perfect. It's meant to be shared. As the reel played, many in the audience began to cry. Even those watching online sat frozen in silence. It wasn't spectacle, it was soul. Every frame felt alive, tender, deeply human. Halfway through the screening, Sandra noticed her phone buzzing. Messages flooded in from viewers around the world. Strangers saying how the video reminded them to call their parents, to forgive someone, to help a friend, to keep going. And as the final scene appeared, Keanu sitting under the sunrise, looking straight into the camera, his words filled the air one last time. We all fade. But if you pass on your light before you do, you never really disappear. The screen dimmed. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the entire room stood and began to clap. Not out of applause, but reverence. People hugged, cried, smiled through tears. It felt less like a film premiere and more like a farewell prayer. Sandra stood quietly, tears streaming down her face. She felt something she hadn't in months, peace. Then Mark approached her. "You should see this," he whispered. He handed her his phone. The live stream had surpassed 50 million viewers in under an hour. People across the world were lighting candles, tagging photos with a single message. Project Sunrise. She looked at the screen in disbelief. What Keanu had started in silence had become a movement in light. As she stepped outside, dawn had begun to break again. Soft, gold, endless. She walked toward the horizon, the cool air brushing against her face. In her pocket, the small letter he had left under the bench rested like a heartbeat. She pulled it out, looked at the final line again. "When you see the first light after the storm, know that I'm home." She smiled through tears and whispered, "You're home now, Keanu, and you took the whole world with you." She watched the sun rise fully, warm, brilliant, and alive. The light touched her face, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something close to joy. The story wasn't about death anymore. It was about continuation, about how one life, one heart, could echo through millions simply by being kind. And as the screen faded, Keanu's final words appeared one last time, the same ones that ended Project Sunrise. "Don't wait for light to find you. Become it." The lake of echoes, the rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind a city washed clean and silent. The sky was pale, the kind of color that promised both peace and mystery. Sandra and Keanu drove in quiet to the edge of the lake where everything had once begun. The theater stood there still, though time had worn its bones thin. The walls were cracked, vines climbed through broken windows, and the stage that once carried dreams was now blanketed with dust and fallen leaves. As Sandra stepped out of the car, a strange feeling passed through her. It was like walking into a forgotten dream, one she had lived long ago but never truly understood. She looked toward the old wooden doors and whispered, "We were so young." Keanu followed her gaze, his voice calm but deep. "We were hungry for something we didn't yet have words for." Inside, the theater was dim. Shafts of morning light cut through the cracks in the ceiling, casting soft golden stripes across the seats. Their footsteps echoed through the emptiness. Sandra walked slowly toward the stage, her eyes scanning every corner as if searching for traces of their past selves. She could still remember that day clearly. The way the air had smelled of paint and rain, the tremble in her voice when she first read her lines, and the quiet steadiness in Keanu's eyes as he listened. That was the first time Elena had seen them together. She had been sitting alone in the back, taking notes, her expression unreadable. Later, she had approached them both and said, "You two see the world differently, but your hearts speak the same language. That's rare." Sandra hadn't understood then, but she did now. Keanu walked to the center of the stage. The wood creaked beneath his boots. "So," he said softly, "where does the light find us here?" Sandra looked around. The stage lights were gone, the curtains torn, but the ceiling still had an old skylight, a round glass window that once let sunlight spill directly onto the stage. She walked beneath it, her voice almost a whisper. "It found us here. Right here." Keanu tilted his head upward, following the beam of faint light. Something glimmered high above, small, metallic. Sandra squinted. "Wait, do you see that?" He nodded. Without hesitation, Keanu dragged an old wooden ladder from behind the curtain. It looked unstable, but he climbed anyway, his movements steady. Sandra held the ladder firm, her heart racing as dust rained down. When he reached the top, he reached into the narrow gap beside the skylight and pulled out a small metal box wrapped in cloth. He climbed down carefully and set it on the stage. The box was rusted but intact. On its lid was a faint engraving. Lesson 18. Sandra stared at it. "Another lesson," she murmured. "She planned this." Keanu nodded and reached for the box. It wasn't locked, but it took effort to open. Inside were two things, a small black notebook and a folded letter. The paper was fragile, edges yellowed by time. Sandra picked it up carefully and began to read aloud. "My dearest ones, if you found this, it means you followed the light. I left this notebook not to teach, but to remind. Every great performance is born from truth, but truth only grows in the soil of forgiveness. The people who hurt you are also your teachers, and the ones you loved, even when you lost them, shaped the strength you now hide behind your calm. Each of you carries something you've never said to the other. This next lesson cannot be acted. It must be lived. Go back to the place where silence once stood between you and speak what was left unsaid. Only then will you find what the final key unlocks." Sandra's voice trembled slightly as she finished. She looked at Keanu, whose expression was unreadable, eyes fixed on the notebook. "The place where silence once stood between us," she repeated quietly. Keanu finally looked up. "Do you remember the premiere in 2006? The question hit her like a wave. She did. That night had been one of their biggest moments. Red carpets, cameras, laughter. But behind the scenes, something had gone wrong. Sandra had been hurting, quietly, after losing someone close, and Keanu had been distant. They hadn't spoken after that night for almost a year. Neither ever explained why. "You didn't come to the after party?" she said softly. "You left before I could," he replied, his voice low. "I thought you didn't want to see me." Sandra's eyes lowered. "I thought you didn't care." Silence filled the theater. For a moment, it felt like the years between them had never passed. The same invisible wall that had once divided them stood there again, fragile, thin, but painfully real. Finally, Keanu opened the black notebook. Inside were handwritten notes from Elena, phrases, lessons, reminders. One line stood out. "The hardest role is to forgive the person in the mirror." He closed the notebook slowly. "She's still teaching us," he said. Sandra sat down on the edge of the stage, her voice soft. "She always believed we carried too much guilt." Maybe she was right. Keanu sat beside her. "You were the first person who ever saw me when I wasn't acting," he said quietly. "And I didn't know what to do with that." She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "And you were the only one who ever listened when I had nothing to say." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the dust swirl in the light above. Somewhere outside, the lake rippled in the breeze, carrying faint reflections of sunlight across its surface. Then Sandra noticed something. A small slip of paper stuck at the back of the notebook. She pulled it out and unfolded it. Written in Elena's familiar handwriting were 4 simple words. "The key is memory." Sandra frowned. "What does that mean?" Keanu thought for a moment. "Maybe it's not a place. Maybe it's a moment." He stood and looked out the window toward the lake. The sun had risen higher, its reflection bright and shimmering on the water. He suddenly remembered something. A moment long ago, after one of Elena's earliest classes. They had gone to the lake to celebrate, just the 3 of them. Elena had told them to each make a wish and throw a pebble into the water. He turned back to Sandra. "The lake," he said. "She meant this lake. She made us promise to come back someday." Sandra's eyes widened as the memory returned. Elena's laughter, the cold breeze, and the soft ripple of the water as their wishes disappeared beneath the surface. "She said," Sandra whispered, "that the water remembers." Without another word, they left the theater and walked down to the lakeside. The path was overgrown, but the stone steps still led to the edge of the dock where they had once stood. The water was calm now, clear enough to see the reflection of the clouds. Keanu stepped forward and crouched beside the edge. Something caught. His eye beneath the shallow water, a small metallic glint between the stones. He reached in, his fingers brushing against cold metal. He pulled it out slowly. It was another key. Smaller, more delicate than the first, with a faint engraving of a crescent moon. Sandra's breath caught. "She really did leave us something here," she whispered. Keanu turned the key in his hand, examining it. There were no clues this time, no note, no direction. Only the small crescent marking. Sandra's voice broke the silence. "2 keys, 2 lessons," she said softly. "How many more did she leave?" Keanu looked at her with a faint smile, the kind that carried both pain and peace. "Maybe as many as it takes to find what we lost." As the wind rippled across the lake, carrying with it the faint sound of distant church bells, Sandra looked toward the far side of the water, where the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. "Do you think she wanted us to finish something?" Keanu's gaze followed hers. "No," he said quietly. "I think she wanted us to start again." But as they turned to leave, Sandra noticed something else. Etched faintly into the wood of the dock, half hidden by moss, were words that time had almost erased. "Follow the light north." She looked up sharply. "Keanu, look." He crouched beside her, tracing the faded letters with his fingertips. "North," he murmured. "What's north of here?" She thought for a moment. "The hills. And beyond that, her house." He nodded slowly, the realization dawning in his eyes. Her final lesson might still be waiting. They stood in silence, the wind tugging gently at their clothes, the lake glimmering like glass behind them. Somewhere deep inside, both felt it. The journey was no longer just about Elena's messages. It was about unfinished truths, forgiveness, and the quiet understanding that even in loss, love finds new ways to speak. As they walked back toward the car, the 2 keys glinted faintly in the fading light, small, silent symbols of a story that was far from over. The house in the northern hills, the road wound through the northern hills like a forgotten melody, curving between tall pines and soft fog. The morning sun was pale, and the world felt suspended in quiet. Sandra watched through the car window. As fields gave way to forest, her mind replaying Elena's voice. "The key is memory." Those words had followed her all night, like an echo she couldn't escape. Keanu drove without speaking, his expression calm but distant. He had always been that way. Quiet when others rushed to fill silence. Yet Sandra could sense the same unease stirring in him. Every mile seemed to pull them closer, not only to Elena's mystery, but to a part of themselves they had left behind years ago. After nearly 2 hours, the car turned onto a narrow dirt path that led up to a hill overlooking the lake. At the top stood a small stone house half covered in ivy, its wooden shutters faded to gray. It looked exactly as Sandra remembered from the few times they had visited during their training, peaceful but haunted by time. As they stepped out, the wind carried the scent of pine and rain. Keanu stood still for a moment, looking at the house. "She lived here alone," he said softly. "Yet it always felt full." Sandra nodded. "Because she carried everyone's stories inside her." They walked up the steps, their shoes crunching on gravel. The front door creaked open easily. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and forgotten pages. Dust motes floated in the slanted sunlight. Shelves lined the walls filled with notebooks, scripts, and photographs. It was as if Elena had never truly left, only paused time. Sandra ran her fingers across a table where old candles sat melted into glass jars. A photograph of their younger selves stood nearby, the three of them smiling outside the studio, unaware of what lay ahead. Beneath it was a sealed envelope, its paper yellowed but intact. On the front, in elegant handwriting, were the words, "For when the light finds you again." She looked at Keanu. "This is her handwriting." He nodded and carefully opened it. Inside was a single note and a small folded map. The note read, "My dear ones, if you have come this far, it means you are ready to see what was hidden. Follow the path beyond the orchard. When you reach the gate of stones, use the crescent key. What you will find there is not mine. It is yours." Keanu unfolded the map. It showed the property surrounding the house marked with old ink lines. A faint circle had been drawn deep in the woods, labeled the Gate of Stones. "She planned all of this," Sandra said quietly. "Every step." Keanu folded the map and tucked it into his jacket. "Then we follow her lesson." They stepped out into the crisp air and followed the narrow trail behind the orchard. The trees grew denser as they walked, branches forming a canopy overhead. The sound of birds faded until only the wind remained. After some time, they reached a small clearing where the ground was covered with moss and fallen leaves. In the center stood a ring of tall stones, half buried, forming what looked like an ancient circle. "The Gate of Stones," Sandra whispered. Keanu took out the crescent key. There was no visible lock, but at the base of one of the stones, he noticed a small metal plate, almost invisible beneath the moss. He knelt and brushed it clean. There was a narrow keyhole carved into the rock. He inserted the key and turned it. A low click echoed through the clearing. Slowly, one of the stones shifted, revealing a small iron hatch beneath it, a hidden passage leading downward. Sandra's breath caught. She hid something underground. Keanu lifted the hatch carefully. A wooden staircase descended into darkness. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the faint scent of earth and candle wax. He looked at Sandra. "You sure you want to see what's down there?" She met his eyes, steady. "We've come too far not to." Together, they descended the stairs, the light fading behind them. At the bottom, the narrow passage opened into a small underground room. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with old film reels, journals, and photographs. In the center of the room sat an old projector on a wooden table, and beside it, another locked chest. Sandra stepped closer, her heart pounding. "She filmed everything," she whispered. Keanu picked up one of the reels and read the label. "Truth Exercise, Year 1. He set it down, then reached for another. Confession, Final Session. The chest, unlike the others, had 2 keyholes. He pulled out both keys, the first they found in Elena's studio, and the second from the lake. They fit perfectly side by side. When he turned them, the lock clicked open. Inside was a thick envelope labeled The Final Lesson. Sandra opened it carefully. There were several handwritten pages and a single photograph. A young Elena standing beside a man neither of them recognized. She began to read the letter aloud. "My dear Keanu and Sandra, when I first met you both, I knew you were more than students. You were reflections of 2 lives bound by the same wound. What you didn't know was that years before you met each other, I knew someone who changed my life. A man who believed that kindness could outlast pain. He was both your teacher and your shadow. He taught me that broken people often become the strongest lights for others. That man's name was Samuel Reeves." Sandra stopped reading, her eyes lifting sharply to Keanu. His breath caught. "Reeves," he said quietly. She nodded slowly. "Your father?" Keanu's voice was barely above a whisper. "No, but—" "Maybe a relative. My father left early. I never met anyone named Samuel." She looked back at the letter and continued reading. Samuel was a mentor to many young actors before he disappeared from the public eye. One of them was a young woman named Mary, your mother, Sandra. She came to me after he was gone, broken but full of light. She believed the world needed gentleness again. That is how I met her. And through her, I learned of you both. Years later, when you came into my class, I recognized pieces of them in each of you. the same quiet strength, the same compassion, the same loneliness. You were never meant to just learn acting from me. You were meant to find the parts of your parents that the world forgot. Sandra's hands trembled as she lowered the letter. She sat in silence, her mind spinning. My mother. She never told me any of this, she said softly. Keanu's expression was unreadable, his gaze distant. Elena brought us together because of them, he murmured. Because of what they shared. They turned back to the chest. Beneath the letter was another small envelope sealed with red wax. On the front were the words for the two who understand silence. Sandra broke the seal. Inside was a strip of old film. She held it up to the faint light from the candle on the table. There were only two figures in the image, Elena and the same man, Samuel, standing near the lake. Written in tiny letters at the edge were the words, "The promise lives through them." Keanu looked closer. She kept this for decades, he said. And she wanted us to find it, Sandra whispered. As they examined the reel, the projector beside them flickered suddenly, its old bulb flashing to life on its own. Both froze. The sound of film turning filled the small underground room, though neither had touched it. On the wall, an image appeared. Elena, older now, sitting in the same chair where she had once taught them. She looked straight into the camera. Her voice, though faint, was calm. If you are watching this, it means you have found what I could not say in words. Truth does not end with death. It becomes those who live it. The ones who shaped you live in every act of kindness you choose, every silence you fill with understanding. Do not look for answers in my lessons. Look for them in each other. Your bond was never chance. It was legacy. The film flickered and ended. Silence filled the room again. Sandra wiped her eyes. She knew everything, she said softly. She knew we'd come. Keanu stared at the dark wall where her image had just been. She didn't just teach us how to act, he whispered. She taught us how to see. They sat there in stillness, surrounded by the quiet hum of old film and the weight of truth. Outside, the afternoon light began to fade, spilling golden hues through the cracks above. As Sandra reached for the letter again, something slipped from between the pages, a folded note with only one sentence. Go to where the curtain fell. Keanu looked at her. That must mean the theater again, she nodded. But why? He stood, pocketing both keys and the note. Because maybe, he said, the story isn't finished yet. And as they climbed back up into the fading light, the air outside felt different, heavier, but clearer. They didn't know what waited at the theater, only that Elena's final lesson was still unfolding. Somewhere between memory and truth, the curtain was about to rise one last time. Where the curtain fell, the next morning, a soft mist lingered over the lake like breath on glass. Sandra and Keanu stood outside Elena's old house in silence, the keys cold in their hands. Neither spoke as the car engine started. The map lay open on the dashboard, but the direction was already clear. Back to the theater, back to where everything had begun, and where something, long buried, still waited for its ending. The road back felt longer than before. The world seemed to move slower, as if urging them to remember. The note had been simple. Go to where the curtain fell, but its meaning carried a strange weight neither could ignore. When they arrived, the old theater stood quiet under a gray sky. The doors creaked as they pushed them open, the air inside heavy with the scent of dust and memory. It was darker now, the broken skylight letting in only faint streaks of light. Sandra walked toward the stage slowly, her footsteps echoing through the hollow room. Keanu followed behind, his eyes scanning the space, alert yet calm. The last time they were here, they had found Elena's notebook and the crescent key. Now everything looked exactly the same, except for one thing. The curtain, which had once hung torn and lifeless, now seemed different. Someone had drawn it halfway across the stage. Sandra frowned. We didn't leave it like that. Keanu stepped closer, touching the fabric. It was rough, old velvet, the kind that had absorbed decades of voices and light. He pulled it gently aside and froze. Behind the curtain stood a wooden trunk. It hadn't been there before. It looked new, out of place in the dusty theater. Its surface was engraved with a single word, finale. Sandra's pulse quickened. This wasn't here last time. Keanu knelt beside the trunk. It had a simple metal latch. No lock this time, no key needed. He opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each labeled with a name. Actors, students, people they vaguely remembered from Elena's classes. And at the very bottom, 2 letters lay side by side. One read for Keanu, the other for Sandra. He handed her hers, then opened his own. My dear Keanu, you have always believed that silence protects others from your pain. But silence is not protection. It is distance. You learned to carry guilt that was never yours to hold. Your father, Samuel, believed the same, and it broke him. Do not let it break you. You are not the mistakes you could not fix. You are the kindness that refused to fade, even when no one saw it. You once told me you feared hurting others without meaning to. I am telling you now, you heal others without even knowing it. Let that truth be the role you finally accept. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter, eyes glimmering with quiet emotion. Sandra's letter began differently. My dear Sandra, you have always feared being forgotten. You believed your worth depended on being seen, on being remembered. But the truth is, you were never invisible, only unrecognized by your own heart. Your mother saw the same in herself, and she tried to outshine her pain with perfection. But perfection is only another mask. You don't need to shine to be loved. You only need to stay kind when the world gives you reasons not to. There is one last lesson. It waits where the lights once fell and where 2 hearts first spoke truth. Go there together and bring the keys. Only then will the curtain truly rise again. She looked up slowly, meeting Keanu's eyes. She means the stage, she whispered. He nodded. The lights once fell. That's here. They climbed onto the stage, standing where they had stood years ago, when Elena made them face each other for the first time. The air was still. The dust shimmered in the faint sunlight. Sandra looked around, unsure. What now? Keanu scanned the floor. Then he noticed something. Faint carvings on the wooden planks where the center light used to hit. He crouched down and brushed away the dust. It wasn't random scratches. They formed a symbol, the same crescent moon that was engraved on the second key. The crescent, he murmured. This is where she wanted us to stand. He pulled the first key, the one from Elena's studio, from his pocket and set it beside the symbol. It fit perfectly into a small groove at the edge. Sandra placed the second key next to it. Both clicked softly into place. Suddenly, the old stage lights above flickered to life. Sandra gasped. The projector at the back of the theater began to hum. The sound of film spinning filled the space once more. On the torn curtain ahead, an image flickered into being. It was Elena again, older now, more fragile, sitting in a chair on that same stage. Her eyes were soft but clear, her voice trembling with warmth. If you have come here, it means you finally understood what my lessons were never truly about. I did not teach you how to perform. I taught you how to feel without fear. Acting is the art of empathy, but life, real life, is the courage to live that empathy even when the audience is gone. Keanu, you always carried silence as your language. Sandra, you carried emotion as your armor. You were meant to balance each other, to remind the world that kindness and strength are not opposites. You are my legacy, not because you became stars, but because you never stopped being human. The image flickered, and Elena's tone softened. There is one final gift, hidden behind the stage wall, something that belonged to both your parents. Take it and let their stories rest in peace. The film ended and the lights dimmed again. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sandra turned toward the back of the stage, where a narrow wooden panel was set into the wall. She pressed against it, and it gave way with a faint creak. Behind it was a small box wrapped in faded blue cloth. She pulled it out and opened it slowly. Inside were 2 objects, a folded letter sealed in wax and a locket. The locket held 2 tiny photographs, a young man and woman standing together beside a lake. On the back were the words, "Forgiveness begins where silence ends." Sandra traced the letters with her thumb. "That's my mother," she whispered. "And that's his father." Keanu's eyes softened. They knew each other. She nodded slowly. Maybe they loved each other once. The realization settled between them, gentle, not painful. Their lives, their connection, had begun long before they ever met. What Elena had seen in them wasn't coincidence. It was continuity. Two souls carrying forward an unfinished kindness, one that had once existed between their parents. Sandra opened the final letter. It was addressed simply to the children who found each other through loss. When Samuel and Mary first met, the world was unkind to dreamers. They both carried pain they could not share, but they found light in each other's courage. Before Samuel left, he told me something I never forgot, that one day their children would meet, and through them, what was broken would finally heal. You are those children, and you have done what they could not. You turned pain into peace. You turned silence into compassion. Sandra closed the letter slowly. Her eyes were wet but calm. She made sure we'd find this when we were ready, she said. Keanu smiled faintly. She always knew timing better than anyone. They stood there for a long moment in the center of the stage, the old lights above them glowing softly, like echoes of a time when their lives were just beginning. Finally, Sandra spoke, so this was her final lesson. Keanu looked at her with quiet understanding. Not to act, he said, to live. But as they turned to leave, a faint sound echoed through the theater, a slow creak, followed by a thud. The projector had started again on its own. The screen flickered once more, showing Elena's face, faint and fading. Her final words drifted through the empty space like a whisper. When you finish this journey, do one thing for me. Return to the place of first truth, not as students, but as yourselves. There is one last message waiting beneath the light. The image dissolved. The projector fell silent. Sandra turned to Keanu, her voice barely above a whisper. The studio, he nodded. The same room where we first looked at each other and told the truth. They stood in silence for a few seconds, the air heavy with memory. Then Keanu picked up the 2 keys and the locket, slipping them into his jacket. One more lesson, he said softly. Then it's done. As they walked out into the fading afternoon, the golden light poured through the broken doors, washing the theater in warmth one last time. Behind them, the curtain swayed gently in the breeze, no longer a barrier, but a reminder that every ending is only the pause before another truth begins. Beneath the final light, the city was quieter than usual when they returned. The streets shimmered faintly under the streetlights, and the air held the scent of rain. It had been days since they first opened Elena's letter, yet each hour since had felt like part of a single breath, one long exhale of truth. The studio still stood at the end of the narrow street where it always had, tucked between old brick buildings and a fading sign that read, Vasquez Acting Room. The windows were dusty, but the place had survived the years untouched, like time had chosen to pass it by out of respect. Sandra and Keanu stood outside the door for a long while. Neither spoke. The weight of what they had discovered, about their mentors, their parents, and themselves, had left them quiet, not in sadness, but in awe. Finally, Sandra whispered, Ready? Keanu looked at her, his voice calm but certain. We've been ready since the first lesson. She smiled faintly, then pushed the door open. Inside, everything was just as they remembered. The wooden floor creaked under their steps. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Sunlight spilled through the cracked window, falling directly onto the 2 wooden chairs in the center of the room. The same chairs where Elena had once made them sit, face to face, with nothing to say except what was real. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Sandra walked forward and sat in one of the chairs. Keanu followed, sitting opposite her. It felt like stepping back in time. 2 students again, but this time older, wiser, carrying more than just ambition. The light fell gently across their faces. Sandra looked at Keanu, her voice quiet. She said this was where truth began, he nodded, and where it ends. They sat in silence for several seconds, the air heavy with the ghosts of their younger selves. Then Sandra spoke softly. Do you ever think about what she meant by forgiveness? Keanu's eyes lowered slightly. All the time. He paused, then added, I think forgiveness isn't about others. It's about letting go of who you were when you got hurt. She nodded slowly, her voice trembling slightly. I spent so many years chasing perfection because I thought it would make people stay. But now I see that staying isn't proof of love and understanding is. Keanu smiled faintly. You were always harder on yourself than anyone else ever could be. She looked at him for a long moment, and then quietly, and you were always too kind for your own peace. He chuckled softly. I'll take that as a compliment. They both smiled, and for a moment, the heaviness of the journey lifted. But then something strange happened. The sunlight in the room shifted slightly, as if the beam itself had moved. It now fell not on them, but on a small corner of the wall behind them. Keanu stood and walked over to it. The wall looked plain, but faint etchings ran along the baseboard, markings they hadn't noticed before. Look, he said, crouching down. There's something carved here. Sandra joined him. The carvings formed words, faded but still legible. Beneath the final light lies what you could never say. She frowned. What we could never say. Keanu stepped back and looked up. Directly above the carvings, the sunlight formed a sharp rectangle against the floor. He knelt down and pressed against the wooden plank where the light touched. It moved slightly. Loose. He pried it open carefully. Beneath it was a small box wrapped in dark cloth. Sandra's heart raced as she lifted it out. On top of the cloth, a tag read for my 2 final students. She opened the box slowly. Inside was a small reel of film, a folded note, and something wrapped in velvet. Keanu picked up the note and read aloud. My dearest ones, you have walked through memory and found truth in silence. What you are about to see is not a performance. It is a moment I never showed anyone, a piece of myself and of your parents that I saved for you. The velvet holds what they left behind. The film holds what they hoped you'd understand. He looked at Sandra, and she gently unwrapped the velvet cloth. Inside was a silver bracelet, simple but engraved with 2 words. We forgive. She traced the letters slowly. This belonged to them, she whispered. Keanu nodded, his voice soft. Mary and Samuel. He set the reel on the old projector that sat in the corner, its metal still cold but functional. When the film began to play, the room filled with the quiet hum of history awakening. On the wall, a faded image flickered into life. It showed Elena, much younger, standing beside a man and woman by the lake. The man, unmistakably Samuel, smiled as he adjusted the camera. The woman, Mary, laughed, wine-tossing her hair. Elena's voice came faintly through the static. They came to me when they had nothing left but guilt and love. Samuel wanted forgiveness for leaving his son. Mary wanted peace for the choices she never made. But in that shared pain, they found grace and made a promise. They asked me to protect their story until the ones meant to carry it would be ready. The camera turned then, capturing Samuel and Mary facing each other. Their hands touched lightly, as if unsure whether they were allowed to. Samuel spoke first, his voice trembling. Maybe love isn't about holding on, he said. Maybe it's about leaving the light on for whoever comes next. Mary smiled sadly. Then promise me this, she said softly. If they ever meet, tell them not to repeat our silence. The image froze, and the film began to slow. The light flickered across the walls, warm and golden, before fading completely. Sandra sat still, her eyes glistening. They knew, she whispered. They knew we'd find each other someday. Keanu nodded slowly. And Elena kept her promise. He stood walking back toward the window where the light fell strongest. The beam now stretched fully across the floor, glowing softly over the 2 chairs. He turned back to her. She said we'd find what we could never say. Sandra looked up, her voice trembling. Then maybe we should finally say it. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The years between them. The unspoken gratitude, the forgiveness, the love that had grown quietly, without demand or expectation. Finally, Sandra spoke first. Thank you, she said softly. For staying kind in a world that tried to make you cold, Keanu smiled gently. And thank you, he replied, for reminding me that pain doesn't have to make us bitter. She stood, stepping closer. "We found what they couldn't," she whispered. "No," he said, his voice low and calm. "We finished what they began." The last of the sunlight faded, leaving the studio bathed in a golden dusk glow. They stood there, side by side, silent yet complete. The bracelet gleamed softly on the table, reflecting the light that had once shone on their younger selves. As Sandra reached for it, a small folded paper slipped from the box, one they hadn't seen before. She picked it up and unfolded it. Inside was a final message from Elena. "When you are done here, go to the lake one last time. Take the bracelet with you. What was once a promise must finally be set free." She looked at Keanu. "The lake," she whispered. He nodded. "Where the story began." They turned toward the door, the studio quiet behind them, not abandoned, but at peace. Outside, the first stars had begun to rise, faint but steady, like the kind of light that never really disappears. As they walked down the narrow street toward the car, Sandra glanced back once more. Through the window, the chairs were still visible in the golden glow. Empty now, but somehow alive. The last beam of sunlight fell directly onto the spot where they had sat, as if blessing the truth that had finally been spoken, and somewhere deep inside both of them, something old and heavy finally lifted. The light that remains, the morning broke softly over the lake, its surface smooth as glass. A low mist drifted across the water, curling like pale ribbons between the trees. The world felt suspended, quiet, and alive. Sandra and Keanu stood at the edge of the dock, the same dock where they had found the second key days ago, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silver bracelet glimmered faintly in Sandra's palm. It was cold against her skin, but it carried warmth in its meaning. "We forgive." The simple engraving felt heavier than any treasure, as though the weight of 2 generations rested inside that small piece of metal. Keanu looked out across the water. The sun had not yet risen, but the first light shimmered beneath the horizon, touching the waves with the faintest gold. "She wanted us to come back here," he said softly. Sandra nodded. "The beginning and the end. It's always been this place." They both stood in silence. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. Somewhere far across the lake, a bird called. Time itself seemed to pause, waiting for them to speak the words that had been waiting for years. Sandra closed her eyes for a moment. "I think she wanted us to understand what forgiveness really looks like," she said. "Not an apology, not forgetting, but peace," Keanu nodded. "Peace that stays even when people leave." He took the bracelet gently from her hand. For a moment, he simply looked at it. The curve of the metal, the faint scratches from years of being held and hidden. "They tried to make peace before they left," he said quietly. "We just had to finish what they started." Sandra stepped beside him, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you think they ever imagined it would happen like this?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I think they believed we'd find a way." The wind rose softly, rippling the surface of the lake. The mist thinned, and sunlight began to push through, turning the world gold. Sandra felt the warmth against her face. She whispered, "Ready?" Keanu nodded. Together, they knelt at the edge of the dock. Sandra held the bracelet one last time, her fingers brushing against the words "we forgive." Then, slowly, she placed it in the water. It sank gently, the sunlight catching its curve before it disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment, the ripples shimmered like liquid fire, then stilled. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of memory, of closure, of the voices that had shaped them. Sandra whispered, "Goodbye, Elena." "And thank you," Keanu closed his eyes. "For everything." They sat there quietly for a long while. The light grew brighter, stretching across the lake until it touched the far shore. Then Sandra noticed something strange. The sunlight reflecting off the water began to form a faint shimmer beneath the surface, as if the bracelet was glowing softly in the depths. "Look," she said. Keanu leaned forward. The glow grew brighter for a few seconds, then faded completely, leaving only still water. But the light that had risen from it didn't vanish. It lingered in the air, soft and golden, wrapping around them both like a quiet blessing. Neither spoke. The feeling was wordless, something larger than understanding. After a few moments, Keanu broke the silence. "You know," he said quietly, "she once told me that truth is never loud." "It waits for you to be quiet enough to hear it," Sandra smiled, and we finally listened. They stood, looking out across the lake. For the first time in years, Sandra felt something she hadn't known she'd lost: calm. Not the kind that hides emotion, but the kind that comes when nothing more needs to be said. Keanu looked at her and smiled softly. "We finished her story." She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "We continued it. The sun finally broke free from the horizon, flooding the world with gold." The lake sparkled like it was alive. Sandra turned to leave, but something caught her eye on the dock. A small folded note wedged between two boards, half hidden by shadow. She bent down and pulled it free. The paper was damp, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Elena's. She unfolded it carefully. "My dear ones, if you've come this far, then you've already understood everything I ever hoped to teach. Art was never about pretending, and it was about remembering who you are beneath the masks. Your parents understood this too late. You, however, have lived it in time. Don't let the light end with me. Pass it on. Teach the next to see not through the eyes of fame, but through the eyes of feeling. And when you look at each other, truly look, know that what you see is the reflection of every person who ever loved you enough to let you grow." Beneath the signature, a small drawing, two intertwined circles. The same symbol that had been etched on the first box they'd found in the studio. Sandra smiled faintly, tears rising in her eyes. "She left us one final note," she said softly. Keanu looked at it, then at her. "What does it say?" She held up the paper. "That this isn't the end." He nodded, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "Then maybe it's the beginning of the next lesson." They left the dock together, walking along the narrow path through the trees. The morning light filtered through the leaves, and for a moment everything felt new again, like the world itself was exhaling. As they reached the clearing near the car, Sandra stopped and looked back. The lake shimmered in the distance, calm and endless. "You know," she said quietly, "she was right about one thing." "What's that?" Keanu asked. "Kindness really is the rarest form of strength," he smiled, "and the hardest to keep." She turned to him, her eyes bright in the sunlight. "But we kept it." "We did," he said softly. They stood there for a moment longer, just listening to the sounds of the world waking up. The wind in the trees, the birds calling, the gentle ripple of water far below. And then, without words, they began to walk again, not away from the past, but forward, carrying everything that mattered with them. As they reached the car, the light caught the reflection in the window. Two figures standing side by side, surrounded by golden morning. And for the briefest moment, the reflection seemed to shimmer, as if Elena herself was there, smiling, proud, and at peace. Sandra opened the door, then paused. "What now?" she asked softly. Keanu smiled faintly. "We live," he said. "And maybe we teach," she nodded, her voice a whisper. "For her." The car door closed softly behind them. The engine started. As they drove down the winding road away from the lake, the sunlight followed, a single beam glinting off the water, off the trees, off the horizon, as if carrying their promise forward. In that golden light, everything felt still. No more searching. No more questions, just peace, the kind that stays.